Public Meeting Act is provided by notice to the Co-Star, Asbury Park Press, Township Clerk's Office, Wall Township Public Schools, and the Board Administration Office on April 4th, 2019. Take a roll call. Mr. Agnizio? Present. Mr. McCarthy?
Here.
Ms. Malloy? Mr. Sanfilippo?
Here.
Mr. Sullivan?
Here.
Mr. Wondrak?
Is on his way.
Mr. Wozniak?
Here.
Ms. Cox?
Here. Mr. Smythe, do you want to start us with the information you have in the handouts?
Sure.
Good.
First, I want to go through somewhat of a recap of the budget process. Current status of our 2019-20 annual school budget is that the tentative budget has been approved by the Board of Education, submitted to the Department of Education, and has been approved by the Department of Education so that we may advertise and hold a public hearing on the 19-20 school budget. The budget process started in October, preliminary discussions with the F&F committee, outlining the parameters of the budget that we were to construct and bring to the Board of Education. The idea, as opposed to in prior years where departments, buildings made submissions for what not only they need, but also what they want for their programs and their buildings, and then we would have to go through the arduous process of making cuts in order to get to a balanced budget. This year the goal was to bring to the Board of Education a balanced budget within those parameters set by the board through the F&F committee. That was done on February 8th. We provided reports to the Board of Education with a 2% increase to the general fund tax levy. We had a workshop on February 26th with considerable discussion regarding that budget with no significant changes, more clarifications and questions. Any emails that we received from board members we addressed through the email and discussed at those workshop meetings. We received our state aid notice on March 7th. Wall Township was fortunate in that we did, not only did we not have state aid cut, we saw an increase in state aid for the 19-20 school year, an increase in the amount of $156,806. We had a workshop meeting on March 12th. There were some other revisions and changes that we made for that meeting. Prior to that meeting, we had a significant reduction in the cost of a piece of technology equipment, part of the infrastructure. Was originally budgeted at $200,000. It was revised to $90,000. We reallocated those funds. One, to take advantage of an EPA grant to purchase additional buses. We were approved for a $100,000 grant. So the funds were reallocated for those purposes, and really it came down to what we were going to do with the additional state aid of $156,000. I provided a memo to the Board of Education for that workshop meeting outlining the other changes, and then with two options with regard to the additional state aid. One, to include in the general fund for the purposes of funding negotiations or salary increases. We're in the process of negotiations with the WTEA. If you remember, at the onset of this budget process, said one of the best things we could do to establish a budget is to have a settled contract. We are in April. It is not settled, but I know negotiations are well on their way. However, the one recommendation or consideration for the additional state aid was to include it, keep it in the budget for the flexibility of addressing needs as negotiated through with the WTEA. The other option was to apply that additional state aid towards tax relief. The board had considerable discussion. There was discussion of utilizing all of it for state tax levy relief, or to use half of it or a portion of it towards tax levy relief or reduction in the tax levy. Ultimately, based on a straw poll vote of the board, was to utilize the funds in required maintenance because we have needs within the district, but also that provided the flexibility that if we needed the funds for negotiations with the WTEA, they would be available. The concern with putting them into capital improvements is we would be restricted in that we would not be able to transfer those funds into the general fund if we needed them based on the negotiations. We approved the tentative budget submitted to the Department of Education, and as I indicated, the budget has been approved by the Department of Education for us to advertise for our public hearing. We had our F&F meeting, Finance and Facilities, on April 1. We're continuing to discuss the budget, and as reported in the minutes of that meeting, considerable discussion with regard to reducing the tax levy, or reusing the additional state aid for the purposes of reducing the tax levy, and to reduce the tax levy even further. So with that in mind, we have a workshop meeting prior to one more board meeting and our public hearing. What I indicated at the F&F committee is that we would provide scenarios for the board to have discussion with regard to reducing the tax levy below the 2%. With that in mind, I will provide a memo and a new revenue and appropriation summary. If you each just take one from each pile. Same for you, and yes, there's one for you, Mr. Gross. As those are being handed out, some of the discussion was looking to reduce the general fund tax levy from 2% to approximately 1.5%, or to address scenarios where we would be down as low as 1.25% and options for 1.5%. And part of the discussion was with regard to a possible referendum within the next couple of years, and going to the 2% allowable with the idea that we would be going out for a referendum in the future. So with that in mind, in addition to some minor adjustments based on discussion at F&F and a review of budget pages, which amounts to $7,000, I applied the additional state aid towards tax relief. That's the $156,000. And then in addition to that, I funded the capital projects, the facility improvements that we've included in the budget. Originally, we were funding those capital projects with $500,000 of general fund, or funds that are, or revenue that is generated in the 1920 school year, whether it be through state aid or the tax levy increase. And what we would do is fund all of the capital improvements, the $3.4 million in facility improvements, from a drawdown from the capital reserve account. Therefore, we would be able to reduce the general fund tax levy by an additional $500,000. So that's a total reduction of $663,800 in the general fund tax levy. It brings the increase from 2% to just under 1%, or to 0.98%. The reduction down at the bottom of the memo identifies what we originally shown as the tentative budget at 2% was an $83.21 increase on the average household in Wall Township. We did discuss reducing it by the additional state aid of $156,000. That was a reduction of $6.28 on an annual basis to the average assessed home. At 0.98% increase, it's a further reduction from 2% of $26.60, so the annual increase would be $56.63. And if we, and just as a point of reference, if the tax levy increase was zero, the annual increase on the average assessed home in Wall Township would be $30.89. And that's based on the fact that the calendar year tax levy is made up of 2 school budget years. So if you take the 18-19 tax levy and the 19-20 tax levy, those are going to be greater, even though it's going to be flat, than the 18-19 general fund tax and the 17-18 tax generated by the school budget, if that makes sense, and I can go into it further. But it does ultimately result in an increase in the tax rate, even though there's not an increase in the general fund tax levy. Now, I funded all of the capital projects with the drawdown of the capital reserve. That's the full $500,000. That brings it down to below the 1%. We discussed in F&F being at 1.25 or 1.5, and what we can have a discussion about is whether we want to fund the entire facility improvements from the capital reserve drawdown, or only a portion of it by capital reserve drawdown, or a portion of the increase, and still fund some of it through the annual budget. And if you recall, I say it every year, I said it at the beginning of this budget process, that a district of this size, we should have on an annual basis a capital projects budget. Ideally, $750,000 for this budget. We reduced it to $500,000 because we have funds in capital reserve, and the goal was that we were going to fund the projects through the capital reserve. But I do believe that the district should have a capital projects fund for the purposes of facilities. However, because we are discussing on the preliminary stages of discussing a referendum, and a referendum would be used for the purpose of capital improvements throughout the district, then perhaps this would be a year, and possibly next year, where we fund all or most of our capital improvements through the reserve and keep the tax levy below the 2%. With that, I open it up to the floor for discussions based on the new information.
Mr. Smythe, could you just then provide an overview of where the district would be with regard to capital reserve? Like what would be the net effect of that drawdown?
Okay, with the capital reserve account analysis, we're projecting currently, depending on the actual use of our capital account in the current school year, but we're projecting that we'll be at $4.6 million at the end of this school year. If we fund the entire facility improvement, and I try to differentiate between capital and facilities because there is equipment in the capital account which cannot be funded through a capital reserve. So this is only for facility improvements. We would fund the entire $3,457,000 in facility improvements from the capital reserve, and our anticipated balance would be just under $1.2 million in our capital reserve account. Now that could be adjusted at year end depending on what funds we have available to put into the reserve accounts at year end.
So all the projects that we've been speaking about, are those still going to get done?
The projects that were included in the budget, which we discussed, the phase 2 of the air conditioning, which included Allenwood and Central School, as well as the roof replacement project at the operations building, is still included in the budget. And the only difference is that instead of funding it like $2.9 million from capital reserve and $500,000 from the annual budget, we're going to be funding all 3.4 from capital reserve, not from the annual budget. And the concern with that is if we're looking to have a renewable appropriations or recurring appropriations for capital on an annual basis, then you would want a corresponding annual revenue. And we're not going to have that if we're going to fund it through capital reserve and not through the tax levy. However, by going to 0.98%, that generates banked cap, so that 1% that we're not using in general fund tax levy would be available to us in the next 3 years in the event that in constructing future budgets we find it difficult to fund the current expense budget as well as the capital budget.
Which would in fact affect the tax levy at that point, because then it could go above the 2%.
Yes. But I think there's some merit to the fact that if we are looking to do a referendum for capital improvements, and that referendum would address a majority of our capital improvements, then we may not be as reliant on funding the capital reserve account. And if it's within the cycle of a referendum, within the cycle of 3 years for the ability to use bank cap, then if a referendum is not successful, then we have the ability to tap into the bank cap in order to fund the projects that we would otherwise fund through a referendum.
So it seems like we either pay now or pay later, but all at the end of the day, we're going to pay. Yes, no? No?
Yes. Brian, with the changes in the budget, I know you said that all our capital projects are, but what other miscellaneous items have been removed or?
From the nursing supplies.
Maybe reduced.
You know, in the nursing supplies, the funds budgeted for defibrillators were reduced by $3,000 based on further discussions with special services and a review on the current actual costs of defibrillators. They budgeted for 2. The cost was identified as being high, so that was reduced $3,000. And additionally, reductions in the communication account for the use of cell phones. There's a reduction in 2 being taken off the plan this current year, and an additional 5 that are being charged to the wraparound program, because that's what they're used for.
So our communications account will still be about $5,500 a year, correct?
For cell phones?
Yes.
Yes.
So I brought this up since we only have by contract one person that's supposed to have a district-funded phone. Who's getting phones?
I mean, we can go through the positions that have them.
Because, I mean, again, we're a school district and we shouldn't be providing cell phones. That, to me, is another $5,500 that could be used for something else, or it could be put towards tax relief. Because, you know, because technology guys going to the school, they don't need a cell phone. If they're in a school and you know where they are, you page them. I mean, that's why we spent all that money on every classroom having telephones.
Well, for example, would our director of, well, what's Mr. Redu, director of? Athletic director. I assume he would have a cell phone in case there is an emergency and he's at a different field, correct? Or could we look into doing an allowance? I mean, because again, do we need to pay for the whole cell phone? Can we give them $50? Because I'm sure everyone has their own cell phone. Have we given that any consideration?
With regard to the positions, you know, that could be a discussion by the board. You can ask for advice from your attorney. I don't think he'll give it to you at a public meeting. Or that could be part of negotiations with regard to how cell phones would be funded or provided. But there's a number of positions. The athletic director is one of them, facilities manager, the assistant facilities manager has one, our transportation director has one, our assistant transportation supervisor has one. We have them for use for school buses. Our director of technology has them. We have 2 technology staff members. I'm kind of going by memory. Not all technology has them.
No, only the 2 who are in charge of the network, and so when the network goes down, even on the weekends, and we need to get in touch with them. But as Mr. Smythe was saying, it's the high school principal, athletic director, the athletic trainer, because he's also out on the fields and needs to be able to call 911, contact people in an emergency, the superintendent, the director of technology, as I said, the 2 network admins, the facilities manager and supervisor, and also the transportation director. And the cell phones, because we have a plan that, is for a school district business, they're about $53 a month for unlimited everything. So, certainly we could look at the cost benefit of giving people money and whether or not that's allowable. I'm not really sure. But that's a pretty reasonable amount. And I do think that the folks who have cell phones absolutely need them. We need to be able to get in touch with those individuals.
I don't disagree that they absolutely need them. But again, if we only need to get in touch with the people for the network nights and weekends, I'm sure they have a cell phone, and I know I won't carry around 2 cell phones. My company switched to allowances. I think a lot of companies have. So to just pay $50, they're responsible for the phone, and as long as you can get in touch with them, maybe we could research that.
I also thought that the high school principal gave up her cell phone. That's what we were told.
We maintain a phone for the high school principal.
So we're paying for a phone that's not used.
No, it's
we were told that there is no phone. Like, she doesn't use the phone at all. So now there is a phone that's used. Okay. And then
When you say we were told, who told?
we had this discussion, it was either at F&F or a board meeting, that the only person now that has a cell phone by contract is the superintendent.
That's by contract.
Right, but the principals gave up their cell phones.
Those are two different topics. What was
Okay.
discussed in F&F is that there's only one
Okay.
contract that has a phone included in it.
Okay, that's fine, but
Okay.
we were told that they gave up their cell phones. And this is probably going back a year and a half, 2 years ago. So, I mean, and by contract, we only have one employee that's supposed to have a cell phone. Everybody else could use their own phone. You know, and we've run into problems before. We had, an $18,000 cell phone bill because somebody took one overseas a couple of years ago. So, you know, having cell phones and all this stuff, you know, maybe it makes people feel good about themselves, but certainly I don't think the taxpayers should be footing the bill for this stuff. I really don't. And, you know, when the athletic director's out on the field, the portable radios they have communicate right with Wall PD. They're able to call Wall PD on them.
I think we should look into the allowance. I do think that in this day and age, people need cell phones, period. So regardless of if they use it for 10 or 20% of their job, they need a cell phone. We need to be able to get in contact with them. Something happens at the school building, you want to be able to get in contact with the principal, if the roof caves in or whatever it is. So maybe we just look at doing some type of allowance, so then we don't have to worry about if someone takes it overseas, because guess what? We're only paying $50 a month. Somebody put that on their list.
Mr. Smythe, with regards to the defibrillators, we're not cutting them from the budget, we've just reduced the cost?
Yes.
What was budgeted was actually considerably more than what we were looking to get.
So I don't know if it was the quantity that was listed incorrectly or the dollar amount. So I kept the quantity, reduced the dollar amount.
Yes. Which is totally reasonable because we need them.
So what happens if we have an emergency? Let's say we have a roof collapse. God, knock on wood, that doesn't happen until after January. Or something, another boiler goes. What happens? Where do we get the money from?
Something along the lines of a roof collapse would be covered by insurance. So we would look to, tap into our insurance policy for those type of repairs. But we would be relying on our capital reserve, and we would go to the State Department of Education, ask for approval to make a withdrawal. If it occurred during the school year, a withdrawal from our capital reserve account, or if there were funds in our emergency reserve account.
So if we went to the, oh geez, I can't even see, the .98 version. If we went to the .98 version, what does that leave us left in? All of our other accounts are the same, so salaries, benefits, expenses for items for the classrooms.
The only other account that changed was where we designated the additional state aid of $156,000 to go, which we included in required maintenance. And that was for projects that would be identified during the year through the Finance Facilities Committee if the funds were not required for funding a settled contract with the WTEA.
What happens if we need funds to settle that contract? Where do they come from?
They're going to come from somewhere else within the budget.
Like reduced teachers, reduced supplies, reduced maintenance?
That'll be a discussion at that time. We would not be able to go to a reserve account to fund that type of cost.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask the dumb question. At one of the iterations of this meeting, when we were keeping the state aid in the maintenance reserve account, it didn't impact the tax levy to do that, but it was there, it could be moved if we needed to for teacher salary negotiation things.
It was not going into a maintenance reserve account.
Okay.
It was going into a required maintenance account. It was in the current expense budget.
Right.
But it could have been reallocated by the board during the school year.
Okay, but if we were to put the state aid in the budget to create a cushion like the one Dory's talking about, then at this point it would impact that .98 tax levy.
Yes,
Okay. Do you have any idea what that number would be?
just short of 0.25%.
Okay.
Because if you look at, when we looked at the budget and reducing it by the 156,000, going from 2% to about 1.76%, it's about 0.24% reduction in the general fund tax levy would be the 156,000.
Okay. So then I would add that to the .98 if we wanted to consider leaving the state aid in as a way to cushion for negotiations.
Yes.
Okay.
What happens next year if we don't get as much state aid? Does that affect this at all?
I would say no, only because at that time, we would have the ability, and when we say would it affect us at all, going below the 2%, we would have the ability to make up that difference in any reduction in state aid with the bank cap that would be generated through this budget.
Dory, I only asked my question because your question made me nervous. The idea that there is, not, that's, right.
And just to confirm, when we do start the budgeting process, we are starting from like a zero budget and working our way up versus whatever everyone had last year, add 15%. Okay, just wanted to make sure everyone understood that.
I gotta say, I'm a little uncomfortable
Cheryl did answer it,
reducing
she
the
said we
tax
do.
levy and depleting our reserve capital account. We're kind of straying away from what we have been doing, which is investing back into our schools. There's no guarantee that in the future, if we decide to go out for a referendum to take care of these capital items, that'll even pass. And then we shot ourselves in the foot and we're creating more bank cap, and we're gonna have to dip back into it. So Dory is right, we're gonna pay now or pay later. There was a board that sat here several years ago that didn't really raise the tax levy, and we wound up taking that bank cap. So we wound up paying later. The tool was given to us at 2% because the state felt that that's what we needed to go to continue our budgets. I don't know, are you comfortable depleting the account? I mean, we're gonna do all this work. We're also gonna be adding, all this air conditioning into the school in the next couple of years. Where's the money for the electric bills gonna come from? I asked that question several years ago when we talked about air conditioning. We're gonna put all these air conditioners in, which I think is great, and I think we need to do it. But there's a cost to it. There's a cost to it in the long term. There's maintenance to all those units. There's an electrical cost to all those units. If we continue to cut the budget, where's the money gonna come from?
Can we do half the air conditioners and then half in the next budget year?
But that's what we're already doing.
That's what we're doing.
We're
Well, then
doing
let's
half of
split
it.
it in thirds.
No.
I don't know, I don't remember who was there for the presentation, but when we got the presentation on the air conditioning project, it's a two-cycle project because the way that they have to order the parts and have them special ordered and the timing involved in it, the way we've broken it up is basically the most manageable way, product-wise and money-wise. Yeah. And also, it's one of those projects that they tell us, like, as you prolong it, the price, yeah.
So to answer your question, since it was geared towards me,
It wasn't geared towards you, it was geared towards the board. It was geared towards the board,
Okay.
Ralph.
all right. Well, one, yes, I do feel comfortable using our reserves, because the reserves are generated because we overcharged in taxes. That's
We
how,
don't
that's how we get.
overcharge.
We do overcharge.
No, you say we overcharge.
Okay, well, we can argue about that, but again, there's
But
two
we
wa-
don't overcharge.
But there's two ways to get reserve. You budget, and instead of saying you need 30 pallets of paper, you only order 25, and you have a savings that way, or you have extra in the budget. Case in point, defibrillators. That as soon as I looked at that number was extremely high. Brought it up, and now it's lower. Talking about cell phones, all of a sudden chopped $4,000 from cell phones. That's $7,000 between two things. So, I mean, there's
Personally, I think more people in the district should have cell phones. Coaches that go on away trips should have cell phones.
you don't think they have cell phones?
Excuse me.
Excuse me?
Excuse me.
Please go ahead.
I'm not done.
Okay.
Teachers that take field trips should have a district-issued cell phone.
So you
The question isn't whether people have a personal cell phone. The question is it operable? There's all other things that come with it. This is a governing body. We're not a private industry.
Okay, I understand you're a public employee, so you're used to handouts like that.
It's not a handout, Ralph.
It is
I
a
don't
handout.
want it.
For the rest of us that have to work and pay
excuse
taxes.
me. Excuse me.
Yeah,
I do work.
Okay,
And I do pay
congratulations.
taxes, Ralph.
Good.
Okay.
Okay?
Good.
So don't say that to me that I get handouts because I'm a public employee. So you're full of it. You have no idea.
But
You have no idea what
represent all
public
these-
employees have gone through in the last several years in this state. So let's not go
Everyone's
there.
a
We're not
public
here to
employee
argue
here,
that. We're
though.
here to argue the budget.
So
We're not here to talk
the
about
Gentlemen,
me.
So the
Gentlemen.
budget's gone up
Yeah.
13% in 6 years. You're comfortable with that?
Yes. You know why? Because we're
Please.
investing it back into the future of this town, which is these schools. And I'm a taxpayer. I pay my taxes, Ralph, just like you do and everybody else here does.
So when you identify things, for example, the defibrillators again, where that's over budgeted, you have a problem with calling out things that are
I don't
high?
have a problem with calling things out like that.
So-
but I have a problem with calling and nitpicking. When we sat here several weeks ago and asked for ideas and ways to lower the tax levy, and it was crickets over there. And then all of a sudden at F&F it blew up.
Well, first of all,
Why wasn't it brought to our attention weeks ago when we first started this?
because it takes a long time to go through the whole budget. You just don't do it overnight.
No kidding.
Yeah, okay. So that's the first part. The second part is that if it was a one-stop shop and you're done, this would get approved in one night. You wouldn't drag it out for a couple of months.
No,
So
this
the guy,
is not a one-stop shop.
Yeah,
That's why
exactly.
we start as soon
right.
as we end.
So to sit here and say, almost like, how dare you bring something up now because we're 2 meetings in, you're wrong. That's not the right attitude. This thing should be looked at up until we take a final vote and we say, did we do the best job we could for the taxpayers and for the students of the district?
I agree with you. I just don't agree with the tactics that you've used. I don't agree with.
tactics is that?
I don't agree with lowering it. I don't agree with gutting capital improvement out of our general budget. I don't agree with it.
So the problem is, if you want to fund all these capital improvements, it goes into the general fund. Then every year, even if we're not doing capital improvements, you're still taxing 2% on that for a one-time increase. So we're gonna put a door in. So you're saying every year going forward, 2% should be based on that cost of the door, even though you're not replacing that door every
The
year?
whole purpose of it is if we don't need to put that door in and we don't need the money, then we don't need to put it into the budget then.
I'm looking at a budget right now where, we can go less than 1% and we still have everything that we were shooting for.
With the one difference, being,
We're-
and that's what I qualified,
We're pulling a lot of money out of our capital reserves.
is that on a annual
not putting
basis,
back.
we should be funding a capital projects budget on an annual basis. In a district of this size, a budget of this size, it should be $500,000 to $750,000 that we intend to do on an annual basis, facility improvements. For this budget year, we're looking to reduce that from all the way down to 0, would bring us below 1%. And the only reason why that's being considered at this point is because the board is discussing a referendum in the near future. Otherwise, the recommendation would not be to fund the capital projects budget from the capital reserve. It would be recommended to fund it on the annual basis, just like the rest of the budget, from the annual budget, and supplement it to do additional projects with funds from the capital reserve account, which is how we started this process with a very significant air conditioning project, $3.4 million. We were budgeting $500,000 of that from the annual budget and the balance of it from the capital reserve. But the direction was to go or provide scenarios to the board to go below the 2%. So I feel the best way to do that, again, considering a potential referendum, is to fund the capital projects through the reserve.
All right, so a few comments. One, I do think that we should continue to look at every account. If we can save $3,000 on defibrillators, that's great. $3,000 is $3,000. If we can save it and do allowances for cell phones, that's not a bad idea, because people then will have a cell phone. I mean, how many people enjoy carrying two? I can't fit them in a little bag. I think we need to continue doing that and look at ways that we can save money overall in the long run that year after year will be sustainable. I am not comfortable drawing down all of our capital reserve. I think if we want to make a statement and give back money to the taxpayers, that's great. I'm a taxpayer. If at the end of the day you said to me, do you really want that $6.28? No, I'd rather see it as a whole. It does more good at the school than it does $6.28, or even if mine is $12. It does more good at the school than it does in my pocket, quite honestly. I do think that we need to sit and try and come up with something that's sustainable, still have money, God forbid there's an emergency, continue on with our strategic projects and our strategic plan, which is funding the schools. I go to other schools. We were in Ocean. They had the nicest gym. I couldn't get over how nice that gym was. I was very jealous. I've been to other schools where they have a beautiful football field and a track. We live in Wall. That's what we need. But how do we fund these projects? When was the last time we went out for a referendum? And did it pass? I know it didn't pass, but how many years ago? 7?
The last one.
It did not pass.
It was
No.
04, 05. The last one that passed was 1998.
I voted no, the last one, if anyone cares. But again, how many other districts have gone out for referendums in the past 3 years and gotten them? Ocean had one. Okay, so, I mean, if we think we have a good chance of that, but I'd still, isn't there something in between here that we can do? Does it have to be all of one and nothing of the other?
Just a comment. So I sort of hinted in the last meeting when we were talking about giving some money back to the taxpayer that those are the types of things that I believe would actually help a referendum pass. So if we're sitting here saying, hey, we're not trying to put the pedal to the metal every single year, and we've cut back when we're spending a significant amount of money this year in terms of the air conditioning, I think that gives us better cause and a better sort of game plan in terms of the referendum and the way that we can explain how we've conducted the business on the board over the last couple of years.
So I have another question. Just full of questions. If we went out for a referendum, and let's just say we went out for a referendum for what? To build a track? What exactly would it be for? It would be to fund specific projects?
Yes, they would have to be identified in the referendum.
Okay, so let's just say we go out for a couple of items. Maybe it's, what's normal, $8, $10 million? 20?
It would vary. It would be dependent on the needs of the district.
Let's just say it's $10 million. What would that cost the taxpayers at referendum time?
Well, the reason why the discussion of a referendum is coming up is we have debt service that is going to be coming off the books in the relatively near future. We have some coming off in 20 and significant amount coming off in 23, 24. We would stage a referendum so that we would sell bonds in a phase according to our debt service payments, so that the idea would be there would be no tax impact to the to a resident in Wall Township, and if possible, a reduction. But the idea with referendums, and it's what most districts do, when debt starts coming off the books, you go out for a referendum, and you do it with the goal of keeping a steady tax rate, so there would not be an increase. And even if there was the idea that you could possibly have a tax decrease, they typically would not include that in the current year, but what they would do is shorten the term of the referendum so that a Board of Education 15 years from now would have the ability to go out for a referendum because debt would be coming off the books for them, as opposed to stretching it out for a 20-year, for 20 years with a reduction in the current year.
So the debt that's coming off of the books, does that have any financial impact on the school district budget or on the taxpayer?
On the taxpayer, because it's factored into the tax rate, but not on our annual budget. Because a referendum is basically a budget that's been approved by the taxpayer, and it's not voted on annually because it's voted on the referendum, and then it's just carried and applied to the tax levy on an annual basis, based on our debt service payments.
So then what happens to the district if the debt comes off the books, we go out for referendum, and it's not approved? Then what is the impact on the taxpayer?
Well, the tax rate would go down. So our general fund tax levy would go down, and there would be a reduction in taxes. And the idea of that is at some point you would need to do facility improvements, so therefore you'd be going out for a referendum, and with that referendum there would be a tax increase. So school of thought is you go out prior to your debt coming off so that you could phase the bond sale so that it is consistent. Yes.
Brian, so can I ask a question? So say just, and this is just throwing a number, say it was $10 million or $20 million. In terms of the referendum, there's a whole bunch of items that are listed in there. Certainly, there might be some variance in terms of what the projects actually cost and, in reference to the actual amount of money that goes out for a referendum. If there was money that was left over from that referendum, would that money be able to be placed into that safety cap that that would kind of support the district a little bit as well?
Well, the balance of it would be used to pay off the bonds that were sold for the referendum.
And does that money have to be used within 1 year, or is it 2 years or 3 years?
No.
So it's over a course of time, so.
Over the life of the project,
Okay.
which you can phase over multiple years.
Okay.
Now, conversely, you could use funds from your capital reserve account to pay off debt service that is on your books.
So one other question, to your knowledge, do you know if we have any balance that's going back to pay the funds from the old referendum?
No.
No, okay, I didn't think so, but I was just,
That would have been,
paid off years ago?
yes.
Okay.
That would have been reconciled.
No projects from '98 floating around still?
So then, if we do the 0.98% and we draw down the $3.45 million, it leaves us $1,182,000 in our capital reserve.
Yes. Which we fund annually at year end with a certain percentage of surplus. Plus, we have budgeted funds in the current year. And we're reappropriating some for paving projects, for other improvements. We reappropriated some already for the air conditioning. So we anticipate having a balance, which I've done my best to estimate what we're going to have based on the projects that have been discussed in F&F. And that would be returned to the capital reserve account at year end. But that's incorporated into the figures that you have.
So
to the
that's
4.6.
that includes the 1.1.
Yes. Now, if there's additional surplus at year end, the board by resolution in June can approve, like we did last year, we put funds in emergency reserve for the purposes of health benefit increases or security. In future budgets, you can put funds into your maintenance reserve as well as your capital reserve.
But that still doesn't address the issue of not having any buffer for negotiations.
Correct. And
So if we put the state aid back in and put it someplace where we could use it for negotiations, that would bring us to a tax levy of 1.22%?
Yes.
Okay.
Approximately. I don't want us to start adding percentages together based on two different figures and then be held to it.
And could we model that and see those numbers as well?
Yes.
Thank you.
But it would be, we'd be moving toward the 1.25% tax levy increase. And just so you're aware, and that would only apply to the additional state aid, the $156,000, if you wanted the flexibility for the purposes of negotiations. You can't utilize, anticipate reducing the tax levy with those funds and funding, reducing the amount of additional funds you're using for the capital projects through the capital reserve, because those funds are not they don't offer the flexibility for negotiations.
So then we could keep that 156,000 in and then just take 150,000 out of the operating budget versus the capital?
Well, what we would do is we'd still fund the capital projects by 100% drawdown on the capital reserve of the $3.4 million. However, we would not, and we would reduce the tax levy by $500,000, but we would not reduce the tax levy by the additional $156,000. And we would maintain the $156,000 in the required maintenance accounts that it currently sits in.
And we could make that $156,000. It doesn't have to be $156,000. It could be $127,540 if we wanted it to be.
Yes.
Okay, see, we have flexibility. So my point is, we could make it 130, 150, you know. I see the point. We want to get to a lower tax rate to make everyone happy. But I don't want to go too low where, you know, we're going to have concerns. And again, my term is up in January, so you feel bad for the next board coming in. And as a taxpayer, I mean, at the end of the day, I have kids in the school and I pay taxes, so it's going to affect me for at least another 10 years.
Well, you know, the rationale with regard to the approach that we used was the discussion, based on the last discussion at the workshop with the additional state aid of $156,000. What are we going to use it for? You know, rather than taking a portion of it, it was additional state aid, so we were either going to use it in the current year budget or, use it to reduce the general fund tax levy. And then the only other approach would be funding the capital projects, and whether you're going to fund $250,000 from, the capital projects fund or the additional $500,000. If the goal of the board was to get to below 1%, I figured we would fund 100% of the capital projects from the reserve account, again with the idea of the discussions the board's having with regard to a referendum. We're in the process of, we received RFPs for architectural services, a demographer, and the committee's currently review that to do the assessment on our district for the purposes of planning for a potential referendum.
And this wouldn't, like, the state wouldn't get upset if the money that they gave us for education we give back to taxpayers? No?
I don't know. That's a question for me to address. That's for the board's decision, what you're going to utilize the additional funds for.
The referendum is a pipe dream. And it's a pipe dream because we haven't completed the air conditioning. And we don't know where the air conditioning is going to take us yet. If we could do one thing correctly and get that done, and then go back to the trough, we don't know where the air conditioning is going to take us. We know that we bought some computers. That's solid. But the air conditioning, we don't know. We're talking about parts. We're talking about this. We didn't talk about the guy that's going to fall off the roof, or it's going to cost us this, or going to cost us that. And that comes out after we're into the budget. And then we start taking things from other places. We should do one thing correctly and get through the budget year. And this is going to take a whole year. Or maybe it's not. It's going to take us at least through October, right?
Yeah, well, the current project that we're doing out of the current school year, 18-19, is slated to be completed prior to next school year, or September 2019. But that's in the current year budget. The 19-20 budget would be completed in the summer of 2020.
I understand that, but that's taking everything like it's all going to work like it's supposed to work. We don't know that. I mean, you got a budget and you got a plan, but we don't know that. And I'm afraid that we're going to get stuck with something until we get further into this project. And I'm not against the project. It's good for the kids.
I don't think that the discussion about a referendum is something that would take place until after that project was completed. Am I wrong on that? I mean, it takes an awful long time to plan and.
Well, the discussion of a referendum, I think, is started now in the sense that, you know, the F&F committee has solicited RFPs for architectural services for the purposes of bringing them on board to help do assessments on the district and to plan, as well as why we're looking at a demographer so that we can plan accordingly. The lead time for a referendum is considerable. You know, just for notices to County Board of Elections, you know, submissions of schematic drawings to the Department of Education. So it's a 2-year process for, year and a half to 2-year process for referendums, and I think we're at the beginning of it.
Okay, so, but that would be really the earliest that, that we'd be embarking on that process.
Because, sorry, then just to add to that, one of the things we discussed in F&F too was we wanted community input. So that's a factor too. So in addition to all the professional and technical stuff, we also want to be able to have community input as well so that there's buy-in.
I just want to make sure that whatever number we agree on, that it's sustainable. To the best of our ability to look in a crystal ball. You know, we already had to utilize that reserve amount for health benefits. So, like, something is already not sustainable. So that's my concern.
Well, the discussion of the referendum is just to rationalize why we would fund the capital projects budget 100% from the reserve account as opposed to from the annual budget.
I would like to have my say. One, I want to commend Brian for getting this down to below 1% after we had this debate inside F&F. I know we had some vigorous debate that night, and to get it down 1% is a good, really good start, which I'm proud of that. I am concerned about just getting these sheets right here at the meeting. It would be nice to have it ahead of time so we can be able to digest it a little bit more, plus also for transparency for everybody. That's a good start. In regards to a referendum, if we come down to one down the road, I think we should be at a point in time when we have most people here in town so that everybody can have a voice instead of not like during the winter months trying to sneak it by on when people are out of town or out of the state. I want to say thank my fellow board members that I'm learning a lot more about this cap reserve tonight because I'm kind of understanding a lot more. And yes, we do have it where we are looking at the RFPs for demographers, which should help us get a better understanding of future enrollments coming up, which if if I look at it, we go from 2009, where we went to 4,313 students, to last year to 3,410. So we're having a constant declining enrollment. Who knows where that's going to be in the next few years? And yeah, I think we do need community input as to our budget and any kind of referendum and everything. So that's my input on this. Thank you.
Dorian,
Yes.
wait, are you going to talk? I was going to,
Maybe.
go ahead.
So just, you mentioned the decline in enrollment, but the increase in the budget. Do we know at the enrollment in 2009 how many students were, how do we classify them, as classified? Or additional services necessary versus how many now?
The overall percentage has remained fairly constant. It's gone up a little bit. So I believe we're at about 20% now of our students have IEPs, maybe 18%. It was probably closer to 14% in 2009, but I'd have to look that up for you.
Okay, just curious.
Are there any other questions or comments from the board with regards to the tentative budget?
Just the only other point I would make with regard to enrollment is that our meetings with the town administrator and the town council and discussions about affordable housing and projects that are in the pipeline, do give us information that we're going to need to plan, and obviously the demographer will help solidify this information, but we are going to have to plan for increases with the developments that are in the pipeline for families, not just for senior citizens, et cetera.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments with regards to the budget? Do you need anything specific from us this evening, or should we continue to email you, or would you like direction?
Currently we have an approved tentative budget that's at 2%. If we're gonna look to present something differently at the public hearing on April 30th, I think it would be beneficial to have that discussion, and, it'd be in the best interest of the district and the community if we can have a budget that's approved by all members of the Board of Education. That would be my goal. So I took direction from October through February, and, with the administration provided a budget in accordance with those parameters. We had a F&F discussion on April 1st. I provided, maybe to the extreme. As we talked about 1.5%, we talked about 1.25%. I gave you a budget at, just below 1%, again, because I think the rationale of if we're looking to give the state aid for tax relief, and we're looking to fund the capital projects with the reserve, whether you do it at, 500,000 or only 400,000, and you charge, I think it would be more beneficial if you're gonna do anything, you're gonna vary from this current proposed recommendation, would be to put the additional state aid back into the budget for the purposes of flexibility, because that's the big unknown. I said it from the beginning, where we're gonna be with a settled contract and what the costs are gonna be. It would be beneficial to have the flexibility in order to use the funds. But I would work with either budget. I think there's 3 on the table right now.
So-
0.98, 1.25, and the 2%.
So, where's the 1.25?
Well, that would be
Yeah.
putting
That's-
this additional state aid back into the budget.
Okay, I agree.
Somewhere in the middle.
I would also have to say I'd go with the 1.25. I think we definitely need the flexibility, we need that cushion there.
I just approximately 1.25, right?
I like below 1%.
If we're here right now, below 1%, I'm gonna stay with that for the time being, so I'm happy with that.
I'm 1%.
I'd like to think about it for a little bit. I asked the question last meeting whether the $156,000 was going to help in terms of the negotiations, and I was told that it wasn't necessarily going to be anything that would help. And I would assume that maybe going from 2% to 0.98% might have made a little bit of a difference there, but if it's all the same, I'd like to think about it as opposed to specifically putting something down in pen at this point in time.
Can we just confirm who told you it wouldn't help?
Well, I think there was a couple of voices. I actually went back and I watched part of it today, but they said that there wasn't going to. I think it's possible Cheryl might have said that we didn't know whether it was going to make a major difference either way at this point in time. Is that correct? Not correct? I don't recall. You don't?
I don't recall saying anything like that, because I did mention that negotiations are confidential, and certainly, you can anticipate that the Teachers Association is requesting an increase, and $156,000 is $156,000. And so, yes, it certainly could make a difference.
Okay. I'll go back and recheck the video on that.
I actually think that the approximate 1.25 is a good compromise plan that gives some meaningful relief on the tax levy, and also provides the flexibility that we're going to need in this year, and provides some comfort level of sustainability.
I keep going back and forth because I don't like the idea of making one board beholden to another board. And I sort of feel like all the referendum talk leaves future boards beholden to the decisions that we're making at the table right now. But I mean, I guess that's the way with any elected body, that the decisions made are going to carry forward. So the drawdown, I think similar to Dory, the large drawdown on the capital reserve does make me nervous for that reason. But the reasons you're explaining make sense. And while I'm not privy to the details of negotiations, I do think that keeping a little bit of a buffer in the budget with regards to them makes the most sense. So I think I am more comfortable with the approximate 1.25 number than I am with the 0.98 number. But that's how I feel about it right now. I'm going to reflect on it a little bit too.
And again, just as a side comment, we are told at numerous board meetings how, the board needs to pay the teachers more money. And then the same person might get up and say, I want lower property taxes. There's only so much money in the budget to go around. And trying to make it work and be fair to everyone, I think 1.25 or 1.23.87, whatever it may be, leaves us a little bit more flexibility than bringing us down to bare bones where, again, it could create issues, like you said, down the road for the next board.
Any other questions or comments from the board? If we have any thoughts or comments, it would probably be good to bring them to Mr. Smythe's attention prior to the April 16th meeting, because, of course, as part of the F&F minutes conversation and old business, we can revisit this conversation if we need to provide him further direction prior to the public hearing on April 30th. So I would just say, keep communication open with him, and any questions or comments with regards to this budget, this conversation, make sure you express honor before the 16th. Does that work, Mr. Smythe?
Sure.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, so
Can I
then,
ju-
oh, sorry.
I'm
Mrs.
sorry, can I just interrupt one more minute? Just to clarify what $156,800 might do in negotiations. The current base of the salaries for members of the WTEA is $36,589,410. So that is 0.4%. 156,800 is 0.4% in terms of what that means, right? Thank you.
If there's no further questions or comments, we will open the floor for public comment pursuant to policy 0167.
Hi, I'm Betsy Cross. I live in Wall Township. Just wondering, I think I'm definitely going to need to go over the 5 minutes, so Ms. Connolly, when everybody else speaks, it doesn't look like we have a lot of people here. We might have a couple people come up. Would you allow me to come back again on the 5 minutes?
We're sticking to the 5-minute rule tonight, Mrs. Cross.
Okay. I'm not sure why Mr. Gross is here. I'm not sure why we're paying him to be here tonight, and I don't think he's necessary. Glad to see that Kim Keeter's not here. I'd like you to take out of the budget her overtime to come at meetings, 4-hour minimum. That's the first thing I would take out. We shouldn't be paying her to go to a football game and graduation. Could Mr. Smythe go over what happened with the bids for air conditioning? Performance and mechanical looks like they were cheaper, but Mr. Smythe says that he's missed something. He's non-responsive. I did send in an email. I'd like him to go over that tonight. Board member policy on social media. We're having a lot of issues with that. Dory Malloy is a big offender. I suggest everybody take a look at that. I did give a copy of it to the co-star. I don't think I'll have time to read over Dory's emails, but they will be read next week. I also think she should probably resign before they're read. Excuse me, what'd you say? Fat chance. Fat chance? Okay, good. Thank you for that. Referendum, well, while Mr. Smythe is still here, while Cheryl Dyer is still here, while Allison Connolly's on the board, while Dory's on the board, a referendum will never pass. And let me include Mike MacArthur in that. We couldn't even get 37 light bulbs in before the play. So I have a hard time understanding how you're working on the $77 million budget. Can I see a show of hands who actually pays taxes in Wall Township on the board? Ms. Connolly, did you raise your hand?
Continue, Mrs. Cross.
I went over to the tax office today just to check, and as far as I understand, your house is not paying taxes. There's nothing more disturbing than the board president actually not paying taxes. What's outrageous, Dory? What's outrageous?
Ms. Cross, I'm going to stop the clock just for a
Why?
second, because people are interrupting you, so I want to stop the clock for a
Okay.
second. And I also want to remind you to be very careful as to what you say. This is a
I'm
public
going to
meeting.
be
It is
very
being re-
careful, Mr. Gross,
I
because
just
we
want to
will all go
remind you,
back and listen to this tape. We will be very, very careful.
I am not your
I am going to give you
lawyer.
a copy of a tax lien.
I'm going to start
And
your
Ms.
clock
Connolly,
again.
you can start my clock again. And Ms. Connolly, if you could go over if you are paying your taxes. If you're not paying your taxes and this tax lien is correct, I suggest you do not vote on the budget because you are not contributing to pay for it. I also suggest you do not vote on Ms. Dyer's contract. I suggest a resignation from the board if this is in fact true, and if you do not resign, then I suggest you do not vote on the budget or you vote on Cheryl Dyer's contract. I'm going to make that very clear. Transportation, we need an audit. There was a report that came out that said you were you were overspending by about $250,000. Spend $20,000 on a transportation audit, will save $230,000 next year. I look at this very quickly. 2% on your tax levy is $1.3 million. Right now, you have $996 for salaries and another $900,000 for health benefits. So you're short $665,000. Now you have to tell us what you're cutting, because every year it's the same thing. You're cutting things from the students. This, again, was a waste of time for everybody here. I sat through it the first time. It's peanuts talking about cell phones. We have to figure out, we need to get rid of the business administrator who isn't doing his job and stop giving him raises and have him stop not providing public information. He unredacted a few things of Cheryl's contract, but left out all the important issues. So he needs to be written up for this. It happens over and over again. And he's been sued now, and he will continue to be sued. Why did you pick Allenwood and Central for the air conditioning? I kind of missed that. How did you pick that? What else? Health benefits. You made changes in 2017. They didn't make any sense. Employees are contributing less. You're capping their contributions. The taxpayers are paying more. It didn't make any sense what you did, and I'm sure Drury was involved in that. This to me is so frustrating when I look at these numbers. The employees are contributing less, and now we're contributing more. And then the administrators are now capped out at a 30% contribution when it used to be 35, although in your budget report you're saying you're following tier 4, and you're absolutely not. I don't want to be paying 70% of platinum benefits that nobody in this room has. So you really kind of need to take a look at that.
I'll do it. Mrs. Cross, thank you very much. Your time is up.
And here's a copy of the tax lien.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Cross, just so you know, payment of taxes is not a qualification for board membership. Nor
Yes,
would
and
it.
thank you for
Mrs. Cross,
bringing that up.
please,
Let's expedite
please.
it to have it on the books for the next meeting.
Mrs.
On the
Cross.
16th, an expedited
Mrs.
policy.
Cross.
If a board
Never-
member is not paying their taxes, they cannot be on the board. Thank you very much, Mr. Gross, for pointing that out to me. Expedited.
Kathleen Duran, Dubac Road, Wall Township. I'm addressing first the district policy that was referenced by Ms. Cross as to board member use of social networks. I actually do share Ms. Cross' opinion that Ms. Malloy's comments have gone into a place where they may in fact violate board policies on what is allowable public comment, and I would like to request that the superintendent in particular turn her attention to that and address it if necessary. We went down that slippery slope when Eric Brophy was here. He did cross the line. I am still dealing with the ethics committee because of his status as an attorney, and I know Ms. Malloy is not, but I do believe that there are board policies and ethical guidelines in place, and I think she has crossed that line. For the budget, I'm here for my third year to point out that what's missing from the sheet that was published is the most important information of all, which is the percent of administrative costs versus the teacher costs as factored into the cost per pupil. What I did when I took out all the Department of Education figures going back to 2015 is I found that the drastic increase in cost per pupil in the less than a decade now is over 50%. Almost all of that cost was attributable to administrative costs. Now, when Ms. Cross was up here and I saw people rolling their eyes during all the past couple of years, when she was talking about Xerox and cell phones, I had the impression that nobody knew what she was talking about. But having gone over all those contracts, as well as others that we never have time to talk about within 5 minutes, although we've always offered to provide the information and anyone asks afterwards, they're examples of horribly made contracts that drive up the costs that is not being paid by other school districts. So, for example, the Xerox contract that Mr. Smythe entered into was 10 times more expensive than Bradley Beach, and the cell phone contract was inappropriate. The cost due to carelessness on the administrative end and the high cost of bad contracting drives a lot of this. Now, not only do we need light bulbs for the school plays, but I happen to know that I'll speak for the athletes in this school briefly because the uniforms are so old in the high school now. They're being used year after year. They could just about walk in protest out of my house before getting washed. They are stiff with age and stiff with sweat. They're not really appropriate or representative for the schools. And just fixing the Xerox contract alone would have taken care of that. So when Dory Malloy points out that someone's going to come up here and say teachers should be paid more, and yet there's these other costs, what you're ignoring is the biggest hole in the budget. What's missing from this page is the biggest hole in the budget. And that includes the administrator's salaries as well as the contractual decisions that they're making. The operating cost of this school has increased by dozens of percentage points just in the past 9 years. It's unforgivable, and it's not the same in other districts. If anybody takes the time and you go read the Department of Education website, the rate of increase is worse here, Mr. Smythe, than any other place. What are you doing as a business administrator to drive the cost so high when our neighboring school districts, comparable in size in terms of student body, are not facing the same increases? I'm here to call you out on it because I've read the contracts. I go and I look on the other websites, and anyone else can do the same thing. These numbers are on the Department of Education. You will see how poorly we perform administratively. That's the problem here. It's not just it's a cell phone contract. It's the cumulative cost of poor contracting and poor management. And nobody's watching. Everybody's just looking the other way. I'd also like to know why those emails attachments weren't included on Cheryl Dyer's contract. I have a very keen interest in following the process, and I find it very disheartening that Mr. Smythe did not include the attachments for all the conversations that have taken place in terms of negotiating that contract. I think frankly, it's unforgivable. I don't know how he keeps getting away without anyone on the board saying something to him about not doing his job properly. It's not appropriate. We don't need to run to court every time. We don't need to run to court. No one's standing up here saying something that's not true, trying to badmouth someone just for the heck of it. It's sad that you think so, and it's sad that you judge it that way, because it's not. It's actually trying to get to the bottom line where we can all live a little bit more cheaply and afford to keep some wonderful families in Wall. Thank you.
Robin Cervantes. I live in Wall. Actually, it was really, I started looking at the budget just in my chair here, just because I had the same concern coming to the meeting tonight as what Mr. MacArthur said about the electric costs. And I noticed that the same amount was budgeted, I think it was the same amount, I took a screenshot of it. 675,000 is proposed, and 1819 was also at 675. But next year, the air conditioners will be in use for at least the first phase. I would assume that's going to be done over the summer. And I would assume that the next years, I don't know if it's going to be done over the summer or throughout the year, but I would think that that number would be going up as far as electricity goes. So I don't know why it wouldn't have been increased just on the outside chance that you're going to have an increased expense. And I don't know if the maintenance budget was increased for the inevitable costs that come along with that. I recall when I was on the board, controls were always an issue as far as HVAC, and it was always seemed like you needed to have people coming in all the time to adjust those. I can't imagine all the schools having air conditioning, and what that's going to be like, as Mr. Wondrak said. I think it is a Pandora's box. I mean, I understand why the push for air conditioning happened, and it is something at Central School, my kids would come home drenched, in this, in June, and I get it. But I think when you start pulling apart old buildings, you end up getting more problems than you really want. And I'm concerned about that because you upset areas that haven't been upset for decades. I don't know if asbestos is going to be an issue. I really don't know what's going to happen. And I can see this cost probably spiraling out of control. But at least the electricity portion, I would think that would need to be adjusted for next year at least. But that's really all I had. Thanks.
Is there anybody else for public comment? Okay, seeing none, we will close the public comment portion. Before I ask for a motion to adjourn, Mr. Smythe, did you want to address any of the questions regarding the electric costs or the bids or anything along those lines?
No, it's not.
Okay. Mrs. Dyer, is there anything that you wanted to address at this time? No. Okay.
Can we ask any questions?
Joy, sure, go ahead.
Okay, just so I'm clear on this, the Xerox contracts, what years were those?
They expired in 2011.
2011.
2010-11 school year was the last year,
Okay, thank you.
I believe.
And then the light bulbs, did they come in late? Is there a reason that I thought that we'd seen something as to why they couldn't be done before the play? Was it that they were delayed?
Well, we were waiting on the delivery of the light bulbs.
So we
from the
didn't
supplier.
have the light bulbs?
Correct. The contractor was on standby for when the bulbs were, and it's not the bulbs, it's actual fixtures, because it's not a simple replacement of light bulbs. The fixtures were being replaced in the auditorium. Additional work was being done with replacing certain wiring controls. That work was done prior to some of that work was done, whatever could be done without interfering with the existing lights was done prior to the delivery of the new fixtures. However, the new fixtures didn't come in a timely manner in order to complete the project prior to the play.
Okay, and just one other thing, so I'm clear. Ms. Dyer's contract, prior and new, both have been public record since it was approved, correct? They're both out on the public website for everybody to read, every single page of them? They're out there.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
If there's nothing else from the board, may I please have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.